we're happy to welcome today Kim Wyman, the Secretary of State for Washington. I'm just here to talk about what the legislative session, the upcoming primary, next year's presidential primary, and whatever else. We'll keep it informal.
Okay.
I'm Greg Jane, the editorial page editor here, and I'd like to introduce Lauren Dake, our political reporter. We'll be sitting in, and just so you know, we are videotaping this for use on our website. We post all of our meetings on it.
Perfect.
Anyway, so real quick, your thoughts on the legislative session? What came out of it that pertains to your office?
Well, the legislative session was very long. I think everybody is well aware of that, longest in history. And but for our office, we actually had a very good session. Really positive things came out of it. I think the first one was for the first time in 14 years since the library moved into the Secretary of State's office, the state library moved into the Secretary of State's office, we have stable funding. It has really been, over that 14-year period, a long series of pretty big cuts. When you look at for example, the number of employees that the library had in 2001 when it came over to today, literally it is half of the FTEs, half of the budget, which, you know, on some fronts really I kind of celebrate, because it shows that you hear a lot of talk about lean management and being efficient and things. They really walk the talk in the library. But with that, you know, we were to the point going into this legislative session where we were facing a $2.4 million shortfall. I think the last time I was here, we talked a little bit about that, and it was unsustainable. It would have really decimated the state library, which isn't just the building in Olympia. That really would have had an adverse impact on every community in the state, because we have federal funds that flow through to the local libraries, and they can't get those funds unless you have a state library. And part of those funds that we're eligible for is based on the amount of money the state puts to the state library. And in 2014, we saw the first time a reduction in those federal funds as a result of the reductions in state funding. So the legislature passed, I believe it's House Bill 2195, which added a dollar fee, surcharge fee, to the recorded documents. So it went from $2 to $3. But literally that is the difference in having to close the state library down and really being able to move forward. And so for us, one of the really good things that came out of this process over the last 2.5 years is having really tough discussions with legislators. I had legislators who've asked me if I thought the state library was a core service of government. The first time I was asked that, I was really caught off guard. And what came out of that is it really makes you kind of take that step back and answer the question. And what we really found is that you have a group of legislators who are Microsoft techie types who really don't see a need for having a physical, you know, you're seeing it in your industry. Why do you have paper anymore? Why don't you just have an online edition? Why are you wasting all of that energy? To people that really value the library in its sort of historic, you know, books and mortar and all that, bricks, mortar, and books. So we're really trying to move the library forward, and we have a kind of an initiative called Library 21, and we're really trying to start figuring out what does that 21st century library look like, because an all book, all paper library is expensive because you need space, and an all digital format is expensive because you have to pay for licensing and the technology to support it. So there's a sweet spot, I think, somewhere between those two ends, and that's really what we're trying to move to. And
So how do you answer that question from legislators?
it is absolutely a core service of government, and what we've seen is that the way people use libraries is different today than it was when I was, you know, in high school or college, because people are using it to find jobs. You know, people that don't have access to a computer are going to the library to apply for jobs and do job searches. You have, in fact, one of the things, another real win in this legislative session for us is we got continued funding for the Microsoft IT Academy. And this is a program that we're really proud of and excited about, because it gives access to any resident of Washington, regardless of age or anything, the ability to take classes from basic computer literacy, Microsoft Office products, to high-level programming. And they can get that for free. And they can do it online, from the comfort of their home, or Starbucks, or they can go into a local library. So we've been partnering with over 400 libraries across the state. We've had over 16,000 people who participated in the really first year we've been up and running. Now it's all set. We have the continued funding. So we're going to really up the promotion of this to try to get it on people's radar, because it's such a win. An employer can give training to their employees for free. That's a win for the employer. It's a win for the employees. A job seeker can get new job skills or enhance their existing ones. You have up in our area, we have a lot of people who are retiring from the military or being downsized. So you have a very large population of people who are now suddenly civilians, and that's one more thing that they can use to get job skills to get jobs in the civilian world. So
I'm sorry. One thing I want to go back to. You mentioned that the state funding, the federal funding for libraries is contingent upon how the state funds the state library.
Yes.
Are there any states that do not receive any federal funds that, because of that they don't fund a state library?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know. I could find out though. I'm sure I will take that down. Yes, we'll find that out. I think that where the state library rests varies from state to state, but I'm pretty sure every state has one.
And how much federal funding are we talking about that, because of that, goes through and goes to local?
Quite a bit. So our operating budget right now for the state library is $8.8 million, and that's the state funds that we're at risk. We have about $9 million that flows through the state library to local libraries in various forms, but they're grants or it's called LSTA funding, and I can't think of what the acronym stands for, but yeah, that funding flows through. So I mean, it's a significant amount of money, and it's powerful money because we can leverage things in ways that local libraries can't. A good example would be the licensing for the software that you use for a card catalog. A local library would have to pay for that licensing every year. We can buy that licensing for every library in the state, pennies on the dollar to them, and then that saves them that money. You look at, and especially in rural libraries, real small libraries, we're saving them a couple $1,000s a year, but that's a couple $1,000s they can put to a local program or buy more books or e-readers or whatever.
And so that money goes out to all local library systems. Here would be our Fort Vancouver Regional Library.
Correct. And then also we're constantly also working for things like grants. A number of years ago, I think 3 or 4, Paul Allen gave a grant to the state, or excuse me, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation gave the state a grant to bring broadband access to the rural libraries. And again, $40 million grant that really had this powerful impact and reach into communities that wouldn't have been able to afford it otherwise.
So then, okay, let's talk about presidential primaries.
Let's do that.
What happened in the legislature? Where do we go? What is the plan for next year?
Well, as you know, our state has had a presidential primary on the books in state law since 1989, and we've conducted that primary 4 times over that period of time. We've canceled it a couple of times.
I believe the last 2 were canceled.
The last one, 2012, was. Last time we ran it was 2008. Okay. And so, it's an interesting exercise because one, it came out of frustration by voters and many people involved in the political process, because in 1988, Pat Robertson was elected in the caucuses to represent the state of Washington, and Washington State was the only state in the country that had delegates for Pat Robertson at the National Convention. And it really points to one of the kind of challenges of a caucus system is you have very low participation rates, very small numbers, and it's because it's held on a single day in a specific location that you have to attend, and if you are out of the country, out of state, you have to work that day, you may not have the physical ability to be there. Those are all barriers to participating in a caucus. Not to mention, you have to sit down in a room with your neighbors and argue about politics and religion, which a lot of people don't want to do. So, but on the other hand, caucuses are really valuable for the political parties because this is that grassroots talking about local issues and things that are relevant and electing people to go to the national conventions. So when we started talking to legislators last fall, many of them expressed concerns about the budget, and that $11.5 million was a lot of money. I agree. and that for a beauty contest essentially. And so it got us thinking that if there was a way we could make the primary more meaningful, that it would be a return on investment for the voters and for the political parties and for the state. So we had a reform bill that would have required the parties to allocate some of their delegates to the National Convention based on the outcome of the primary results. If you're not familiar with the process, the Republicans do half of their delegate selection by caucus, half by the primary. The Democrats, by their national rules and by their own party, state party decision, decided to use 100% of the caucus results. So it was fairly contentious when we were going to hearings and things, but for me, I was in the county auditor's office through all 4 of those primaries that have been conducted, and I can tell you voters don't like to publicly declare whether they're a Democrat or Republican, and I mean vehemently hate it. And so if you're going to make the voter jump through that hoop, I think it's reasonable to make that vote meaningful. So it shouldn't just be a list-making operation, where we're just spending $11 million so that the parties can get a list of ID'd voters. So anyway, unfortunately, that bill did not make it out of the House, but we still have in state law the requirement to conduct a presidential primary. So if they didn't fund it, they would need to cancel it. So in the final closing session. Hours of the session, they did fund the $11 million, or $11.5 million, so we are going to have a primary. Where that leaves us right now is in current statute, the date is set for the 4th Tuesday in May. And as you know, that is way too late in the process to mean anything. And that was kind of the other part of our reform. We had put in the bill to change that default date to the 2nd Tuesday in March. Early enough in the process that we would be a player. It should, the other part, trying to make it meaningful, I would like to see presidential candidates come to Washington State and talk about issues here. We have 12 electoral votes, and if you look at the states west of the Mississippi, besides Texas and California, we have a lot of electoral votes at stake. So the fact that when we've had presidential primaries, we have seen the candidates come to Washington. 2008, we did see Romney and Obama campaign in Washington State. In 2000, we saw McCain and Bush campaign here in Washington State. And interestingly, when you look at those visits too, things came up that they didn't know about. I think President Obama, when he was a candidate, was in Oregon, and someone asked him about Hanford. And he didn't know what Hanford was. I mean, he didn't know the significance of it. And but his answer was, I'll know by 8 o'clock tonight. And so that's really the power in having a presidential primary. Caucuses are just a different animal, and quite frankly, because you can really have influence over a caucus in a powerful way just by being really well organized, I think it's a different impact for the candidates. So right now what we're doing is we are convening a meeting with a committee, and this is spelled out in statute, that's consisted of the leadership of the 4 caucuses. So the Democrat and Republican House and Senate caucuses will have a representative, and then the 2 state party chairs and their vice chairs. So we have a committee of 9 people, and it's balanced, and then I'm the 9th member. And essentially we have to have a majority vote to move the date. So we all have to agree, at least a majority of us have to
so
agree.
it would only take that committee can move
Yes.
the date. You don't have to go through the entire legislature.
Correct,
or something
correct.
like that.
And essentially what happens is the committee by majority selects a date, and if they agree on an alternate date, then I can set it by rulemaking. So we are shooting for early August to conduct that meeting. Right now we're trying to find a date that works for everyone, and I'm really hopeful that we can have that meeting and move it to an earlier date.
And realistically, the primary would be moved to March?
I'm
which
hoping
was
so,
in the-
yes.
So you'll just have one meeting and then you guys can decide
Hopefully.
on whether to...
Hopefully. In statute, we have to actually, I think the cutoff for making the decision is in mid-September. We have to have it in place, and I have to set the date by October. So we are bumping up on those deadlines. But really, for the local elected officials that run elections, the auditors and election officials, we need to get this date now, because they are already starting to have to think about printing envelopes. And if you recall, when voters get the envelope, there's an oath that not only do they attest they're eligible to vote in that election, they publicly declare, I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican. And so they have to print that verbiage too, which they get from the
Right.
parties.
And I was going to ask, in this state where you don't register by party, then how do we adjust that for a presidential primary?
The political parties will submit an oath, and that's completely up to them what they want that oath to say. And typically, the two parties have variations on a theme, but basically, it says, you know, I am a Republican. I'm not going to participate in the caucuses of any other party, that type of thing, and then they sign it. And what that is doing, and the reason for that is the political parties have a constitutionally protected right of association, and that's what we really bump up against in a presidential primary, is that they don't want people who aren't members of their party picking their standard bearer, and that's a very reasonable, and that's something that I want to protect as well. So the reason for the public oath is that's giving the party assurance that the person that casts that ballot is a member of your party. It's not somebody coming over and raiding.
Right.
Because they have to publicly do it. So even though a lot of voters really, really hate that, it's an important part of the step.
Sure.
Or step in the process.
So then, what else can we do is to make Washington a player in the presidential race?
Really, I think those are the two things. I think the timing of the election is
Right.
what's really, really the most critical.
Isn't it a matter of states keep moving their primaries up and up?
Oh, yeah. It's all over the map. You know, states are still wrestling with that. I know that some states are really late still. I think Nevada, maybe not Nevada, California is really late in.
Well,
late.
they're big enough; they're going to be
Correct.
a player regardless.
Correct. Well, unless it's too late in the process.
Right.
I mean, they're
Right.
June, I think, if I recall, hearing their presidential primary, and then. Yeah, a number of them are later, but you're seeing some great things regionally. In the South, a number of southern state secretaries of state have created a SEC primary, as in the Southern Southeastern Conference football conference. So they are kind of using that theme and trying to band together to have it at the same date, and I believe they're going for the 1st of March. But
Okay, and in fact, I was going to ask, what would it take? It seems to me like it would make sense to have all the primaries on one day, or maybe it spread out over 3 or 4 weeks, but have 10 or 12 states on every day. What would it take to make that happen? Can secretaries of state get together?
That's a
and do
great
that,
question.
or-
We have been working on this. You know, my predecessors worked on this for many, many years. I tried to start that, talking to some of my Western state secretaries and have that dialogue, and it was a legislative process kind of was a hindrance in a number of the states where they didn't want to move their primaries. But I think in a perfect world, I would love to see us move to a regional primary system.
Sure.
So, you know, you divide the country into 4 regions, and then you have 4 primary dates, and then whoever gets to go first rotates every presidential cycle. So every 4 presidential years you would have,
Right, sure.
you would be in first. And then I think then you really look at how the candidates could concentrate on a region of the country. And now they're not traveling across country and you know, going from East Coast to West Coast. So
We're
from
spending 3 straight weeks in Iowa.
Correct, right. You know, and really, does Iowa really represent the entire country, or is it, you know, and you want to tip that tradition and everything to a degree, but I think in the modern era with social media and the access to information and news, I think that voters are pretty smart, and engaged, and I think, you know, you look at our region, I think we would have far more greater participation in people's awareness of the candidates if they actually spend some time here. Yeah.
But a plan like that, it makes perfect sense to me, but would Iowa and New Hampshire go for it?
Well, I think I think you're always going to have to let the 2, Iowa and New Hampshire, go first, and South Carolina is up there too in that front loading. But it's interesting, anytime you talk about any kind of change, I mean, we've had this primary in place since 1989, and it's still controversial to this day. I went to the advisory committee meeting yesterday with the Clark County Auditor's Office, and we talked about some of these issues, and there were members of that committee that staunchly believe I'm wrong. We shouldn't spend $11 million on a primary. It's a waste of money, waste of time. And it's like, but it engages so many more people.
Sure. Now, what will it take to get the parties to accept Washington's primary and to use that solely as the method for choosing your delegates?
It'll take the people really, you know, putting the pressure on the parties. You know, I mean, I think there's a lot in play. Remember that nominating process to the national conventions really is a grassroots process. So this is about precinct committee officers getting together and caucusing, and then moving up to the county conventions, and then moving to the state convention and on to the national convention. I mean, these are the people who are the real party activists. They are the ones that are going to the meetings every month and are really engaged in that grassroots politics. And you know what? They kind of like that it's that grassroots, and that
Sure.
you have to come to a meeting at the church on Tuesday night if you want to participate in this process. So oh yeah, a couple of women on that advisory panel. Really, I mean, they were very passionate about, presidential primary is just a waste of everything. There's no reason we should do it. Well, even your own party voted for it. So, I mean, I realize that the state party didn't, but your members in the legislature did because they funded it. They could have canceled it if they really believed what you're saying to be true. They don't. So, anyway, it was a fun meeting.
And the price tag doesn't change if the date changes, right?
No,
That's the same.
no. We what we did when we estimated that price tag was contacted each county and kind of said, could you estimate your cost and figure out, and we based it. I mean, one of the challenges that we're working through right now, if you remember in 2008, some counties printed the Democrat and Republican ballots on a single sheet of paper. Some printed two separate ones. And what we saw in that primary is the counties that did separate ballots had a far higher acceptance rate of ballots, and the counties that did a single ballot had a very large number of ballots that weren't counted. I believe King or Snohomish County had a 1 in 4 ballots were rejected because the voter essentially made a mistake. And what happens is if you pick a ballot, I pick a Republican ballot oath, by signing that oath, I have to vote a Republican ballot. And when you actually physically make the voter make a choice, they pretty much get it right. But if you put it on one ballot, we got very creative. Our county didn't, but some counties had some very creative. They voted for a Democrat and a Republican. Well, that's overvoting. Or they did a Republican oath but voted for the Democrat. It's just like, oh no, we can't count that. And so we're trying to think through. We're working with the counties right now to set the rules for how that primary will be conducted. So that's another piece of what we're doing, kind of working.
Well, then let's talk about this year's primary.
Okay.
And the general election.
Mhm.
What do you foresee as far as turnout?
It's going to be interesting. We're expecting about 85% of the electorate to be eligible. Not every county in the state will have a primary because remember we're in a top 2 environment, as we always have been with nonpartisan offices. But if we don't have, if we have less than, if we have.
So
if we don't have,
let me go back. So there are some counties where there are no races with more than 2.
Correct. The thing, that's where I was trying to get to. Yes, you have to have more than 2 candidates to trigger a primary. So we have about 6 counties in the state that aren't having primaries at all. Most are. And some counties like Clark County have some really exciting races and new territory that they're going to be venturing in. You have, of course, Yakima City is running by district and by court order. And so you have some new things that are happening. I think you're going to see some higher interest in Clark County and Yakima County as a result. But statewide, when we look at the historic turnout for a odd year primary, it's running about the 26% average, which is very disappointing. For me, the thing that's really frustrating is, voters turn out, and this I've been at this for over 20 years. Voters turn out in droves in a presidential election for a whole host of reasons. Ironically, the President of the United States doesn't really affect your daily life that much. But the people who do, the port commissioners and the city council members and the school board directors are literally making decisions that affect your daily life. From the quality of your roads to the books your kids read in school to how fast a first responder gets to you. Those decisions are made in these elections, and ironically, these have the lowest turnout. So it really, I guess the flip side of it, for those of us who are perfect voters, it really does empower those people that turn out to really have an influence, kind of like the caucus influence, that in the primary election in particular, people that cast a ballot have a lot of influence because most people will choose not to.
Now, you mentioned Yakima, where they are electing a city council for the first time by district. It had always been, every position had been at large. That was a court order which determined that minorities were underrepresented. And I believe the ruling specifically said in areas where, in cities or counties that have a high minority population. I don't know how they define that, and will that impact any other jurisdictions throughout the state?
Yeah, that certainly is. And the benchmark really that they used is the Federal Voting Rights Act, which has been in place for 50 years. This is the anniversary of it this year. There's a requirement in that defines when a population of essentially English as a second language, so say people who speak Spanish, gets above the total population gets above 5%, then it triggers having to print materials in that alternative language. So we have 4 counties in the state right now that are under that threshold, and we anticipate they're going to be doing a new census, not a new census, but a new evaluation of those numbers, and we may see some other counties in the next year bump up to that. But so in Yakima, you do have the very high Latino population, and that was really what brought to light was a woman who was appointed to the city council, community leader, Latina, and then and they run by district in the primary, but they run at large in the general. So she made it out of the primary, but she wasn't elected, and so. And that really brought light to it that there was obviously a problem and everything. So essentially what the court looked at is you have this, clearly there's an impact of the way you're conducting the election, and so now what you're going to have to do is conduct it by district. Sure. And so we'll see how this election goes. So the challenge is in state law right now, cities, unless they are a charter city, can't do that on their own. State law basically says they run by primary, in the primary they run by their district, or they may run at large in the primary, and then generally they run at large. So it does take a legislative change, and we were working with some legislators to try to propose that. It didn't get out of committee, but so we'll be back at it next time around, and that also is,
So I'm sorry. So by state charter, then all city governments are elected at large.
Unless they are a charter
councils.
city, yes,
Okay.
or so the ones in that are in current state law, for example, Kelso is not Kelso, excuse me, Tri-Cities. Why am I blanking on it? Pasco is facing a very similar thread where
Sure.
actually the city council wants to move to district voting. And they just wanted to do it, and move to it because they see what's happening in Yakima. They have very similar threads. They want to proactively do it, and state law won't allow them to.
Huh.
And that's been a real hot button issue over in Pasco because legal counsel has said we can't do it, and it's great that the council wants to do it. And then they pointed to the Yakima decision. Well, that decision was specific to Yakima. It was not specific to it didn't cover the entire state. And it doesn't affect just city councils. I mean, this affects school boards. This affects port districts. Across the board, a lot of junior taxing districts will be affected by this. So we'll work on it.
Huh. Interesting. Off the top of your head, how many cities in the state elect by district?
I don't. I could find that out, but I don't know.
Curious.
Yeah. Well, I think, yeah, they're predominantly the charter city, not charter cities. I'm saying that wrong. First class cities. Let's just not quote me on this. I know tape's rolling, but I should have spent more time getting the right language. But it's like charter county versus a code county. So charter county, like you guys just went through, you can tweak and change the way that you structure your districts, how people run. You can do all of that in your charter. Cities have a very similar process to that. Mm-hmm. That's the easiest way to explain it.
So getting back to this year's primary, and the general election. What do you foresee for the general as far as turnout? And
I think we'll probably be in the mid-50s for turnout there. I always hate predicting because I didn't bring my magic 8 ball, and it makes it much harder to predict. But if you look at trends and things, mid-50s, I would say. And again, I think unless you have a real contentious hot issue, a lot of times voters kind of think, oh, it's not worth my time to vote, which is really sad. This is
obviously presidential year brings people out, but beyond that, is it more important to have interesting local races or like an interesting statewide ballot measure? Obviously, the legalized marijuana brought a lot of people to the polls, and ballot measures like that.
Yeah, and I think when I look at the last 20 years, that is what drives turnout. I mean, we've spent a lot of time in our state, and I'm very proud of it. We've spent a lot of time and energy removing barriers to voters to register, make sure that it's easy for people to cast a ballot. And I think our state leads the country in doing innovative things like that to make sure people are engaged. Still, look at the turnout numbers over the last 20 years. It's driven by what's on the ballot. You know, it really is. I mean, you can move the needle a little, and anything we can do to make things accessible and still balance that integrity side is great. But at the end of the day, people are moved by, you know, I want to change Clark County government because I'm frustrated with XYZ. Or I really just think it would be better for our county to do this. And you know, you guys saw a great turnout in 2014, and I don't think it was just because you had exciting legislative races on the ballot or the congressional race. It was because of that very personal, you know, and certainly, you know, you're getting a lot more coverage. You're giving more coverage to what was happening in Clark County government in 2014 than probably you would have. So I think it's just when it becomes something personal to a voter, they're going to engage.
What else is your office doing to, you know, what other things are you thinking about down the line that can boost voter turnout? Man, 26%.
Oh, I know.
Really?
It's sad. You know what we're trying right now. We're kind of working on our voter outreach. One of the programs we have this fall that we'll be doing, and it's in conjunction with this exhibit we're opening in August, is to vote in honor of a vet. And it's just an opportunity for people to honor a service member and their family or a friend that really has, you know, fought for the right to vote and the freedoms that we have in this country. And so people will be able to post some sort of, you know, commemoration to this veteran, and then we're going to have a pin that we'll send them and that they can wear, and we hope that kind of does it. But I think an answer to your bigger question is really trying to just you know, get to people where they are. So, you know, we'll be bumping up our social media efforts and working with third-party groups certainly on voter registration and updating registration addresses, which is really a bigger effort than I think getting people registered, and just outreach and education. I mean, we're kind of working on gearing up for 16 and what things we're going to be doing there. You know, one of the things I still would like to see is a primary voters pamphlet, statewide, printed one. And this year, with the budget the way that it was and the number of things that we had on our plate, particularly the library, it was one of those things that really just did kind of fall off the legislative map. But we're going to keep working with legislators and try to get that.
Now, you mentioned a couple of things that your office did get through the legislature.
Mm-hmm.
What didn't you get that you would like?
The funding for the primary election, the reform of the presidential primary bill, those were probably the two biggest ones. But we'll keep at it.
What was your take on the motor voter law that passed in
Which-
Oregon?
Oh,
Where people were automatic.
Oh, it's interesting. California is trying to kind of go on their heels. Talking to my colleague in Oregon, they're now the reality of it is, you know, sinking in, and they've got some logistical challenges they're working through. But there's a distinct difference between Oregon and Washington, and I'm not sure that some policymakers are going to want to have the discussion we would have to have. In Oregon, when you get your driver's license, they check for legal presence. There's an actual check in that ID card or that driver's license. We don't do that in Washington State. So I don't think we can have the discussion of automatically registering people when we can't tell that they've met the criteria to be a registered voter. Whereas in Oregon, you can. You know, you're checking for their age, is obviously you need to have proof of their birth date. You're checking for their citizenship status, and the only piece that they're really missing, and they're obviously a resident because they're getting the card, and then the piece they're missing is whether they are incarcerated, which I'm assuming that's a secondary check that they do before they.
And I'm sorry, you said they check that when people get a driver's license.
Correct.
There. Okay.
Correct. Whereas in Washington State, we do not have any
Okay.
proof of legal presence step. Now, that's for the wide swath of people getting IDs or driver's licenses. When you dial it in, we do that for people who get an enhanced driver's license. They're proving their citizenship when they present a birth certificate, for example, and CDL drivers. So the commercial drivers actually have to also show that they're a U.S. citizen. So, you know, so I guess, you know, we could be looking at that narrow band, but even that presents, you know, some challenges. And like I said, I think Oregon is starting to see that. You know, there's a difference when a person walks into a driver's license office and says, you know, are asked, do you want to register to vote? And they say, gosh, that's a great idea. And then they get handed a form and they check a box that says I'm a citizen, and they check a box that says I'm over 18, and they sign affirmatively, yes, I want to register to vote. That's very different than we're going to automatically make you a voter, and if you don't want to be, you have to tell us you don't want to be. So I think they're now starting to be met with some of those challenges. What does that mean? And there are, my experience in this is there are people who do not want to be on a voter registration list. They do not want to participate. They do not want to register. And so, we're just going to watch Oregon. And like I said, if I would love to have that conversation with legislators, but I think that when I look at some of the cities to the north of us, Seattle is a sanctuary city and has a very passionate stand on what that means and why they do it. I'm not sure that the legislators from that area are really going to be open to having a proof of legal presence check at driver's licensing. And I believe we are the only state or one of two that doesn't.
Is that right?
Mm-hmm. I think New Mexico still does not either, but is close. So.
Great. Well, what else do we need to ask about?
Like I said, the one I want to get on your radar is our upcoming exhibit. This is something we're very proud of and has really grown into something we didn't anticipate. 2 years ago, we were looking at all 4 exhibits we would do during my term, and this year, of course, is the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II, so it's natural to do that. And I made a passing remark to my staff when we were planning this that it was a real shame that my uncle, who had served on Okinawa, had passed away, never shared his story. So we lost it to time. So we're having this conversation. I said, I wonder if we have any vets in Washington State from World War II, because it would be great to connect with them and tell our stories, because what we find with these exhibits, the most powerful part of them are the personal stories. And so they started looking, oh my goodness. So over the past 2 years, we've been interviewing these vets from around the state. And what's surprising me is I figured they'd kind of be all the same story, young, GI, went to war, came home. They are these rich stories. They are as diverse in what their experiences were as they are in the people that went to World War II and represented Washington. We have a woman who was on the Boeing line building bomber planes, to a African American man who was in a Marine unit that did some amazing things and served. And what's interesting is their experiences. So Clayton Petrie, the Marine, he talked about he would go off base, and his friends in the unit would go off base in uniform. Some of them would be arrested because people didn't believe they were actually Marines, because they were African American. They couldn't possibly be Marines. And in the modern era, I couldn't even wrap my brain around that. That wow, that was the thinking of the time. Wow, and and I like to think we've come a long way, and we still have a ways to go. But that really just put it front and center. To one of our featured stories is about a German-born Jew who emigrated to the United States in the 30s because of what was happening in Nazi Germany. He ended up being a counterintelligence agent for the United States military. He did all these wonderful things, and then he went and he actually helped to the war criminal trials following the end of the war. And for him, it was going back literally to his childhood home, and helping with the freedom of people there. And so each story is just incredible. And so we've been rolling those out over the last 6 months, leading up to the opening of the exhibit in our office. They're all available online, and I encourage people to go and read them. My dad is very excited. I sent him kind of an advanced copy. We're to the point now where I think we're going to publish a book. That's how good the stories have kind of rolled up. And then
these are all people with connections to Washington.
Yes, yeah. Yes. I think every one of them actually is a resident of Washington. Okay. So, and then finally, we also want people to tell their family stories. And so we have a Faces of Heroes page online where you can upload a picture and then give a brief description about who's in the picture and what the significance is. And that's just been really fun. So we're going to somehow put that in our exhibit as well. And it's just. I think it's important. As I look at my own children, who World War II is like World War I was when I was at their age, it's just so distant and not real. Anything we can do to actually make that connection to our history and understand how we got here. And and history isn't always pretty and isn't always positive. One of the things we're wrestling with the exhibit is one of the men we featured he was at the end of the World War II. He collected a lot of when I say mementos, and he has this really exquisite collection. So he offered to let us have some of it on loan. Well, one of the pieces is a Nazi flag.
Huh.
So that's what we're wrestling with. Do we display it? If so, how do we display it? Is it appropriate? And it's that, history isn't perfect.
Interesting.
So we're, but it's fun. It's fun. Love it. Love it.
Well, it sounds interesting. Well, Kim Wyman, thank you very
Thank
much
you.
for joining us.
Yeah.
Appreciate the time.